Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's event, Evaluating Taiwan's Quest for International Space. I'm Dave Schulman, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub, where our mission is to research and devise allied solutions to the global challenges posed by China's rise, leveraging the Atlantic Council's work on China across its 15 other programs and centers. Since Taiwan's President Tsai Ing-wen took office in May 2016, relations across the Taiwan Strait have grown increasingly tense, with the Chinese leadership increasingly and routinely employing the broad coercive toolkit it wields against the island, including disinformation campaigns and broader influence operations to spread discord in Taiwan and shape political outcomes, engaging in mounting military coercion, including routine incursions into Taiwan's airspace, as well as economic measures that include targeted import bans to hit critical agricultural sectors. At the same time, Beijing has stepped up efforts to restrict Taiwan's international space, building on decades of efforts to shrink Taiwan's ability to engage with the global community. But despite China's relative success in poaching Taiwan's official diplomatic partners and denying Taiwan's official participation in international organizations, Taiwan has been able to use bilateral and multilateral working-level relationships to circumvent many of these restrictions, with the objective of obtaining support for its sovereignty claims, contributing to and gaining information from global debates with relevance back home, accessing preferential trade agreements or blocs, and shaping Taiwan's image, including as a thriving democracy. Taiwan has gained significant traction over the past 5 years in deepening its ties with countries, particularly in Europe, that share similar values. This dynamic has shifted into a higher gear in just the past 2 years, with the pandemic highlighting Taiwan's effective response to COVID and its willingness to help other countries with COVID mitigation, as well as its exclusion from key health-related international institutions. And this year, Taiwan received an outpouring of attention in the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February and following China's aggressive response to House Speaker Pelosi's visit in August, all of which has generated increased interest in the question of how to protect democracies from authoritarian aggression and push back on the sort of coercive measures we've seen China employ against third countries like Lithuania that violate what Beijing deems acceptable engagement with Taiwan. So today's event is very timely in light of these shifting dynamics in Taiwan's drive for international space and Beijing's continued determined effort to constrict it. Our two panels of experts will evaluate Taiwan's success in expanding its global engagement, the pathways that might exist for Taiwan to expand that engagement further, including through cooperation with their European and Asian partners, how China is likely to respond to all this, as well as how the United States, Europe, and allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific are viewing engagement with Taiwan now and into the near future as we look toward the presidential election in Taiwan in early 2024. Today's event is also based upon an excellent forthcoming report by Global China Hub non-resident fellow Jessica Drun that offers an in-depth look at these issues. So we're going to kick off today by having Jessica present the summary of her findings and recommendations. Jessica Drun was previously a non-resident fellow at the Project 2049 Institute and a China analyst at SOS International Center for Intelligence Research and Analysis. She's also held positions at the National Bureau of Asian Research, the National Defense University, and the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And Jessica specializes in cross-strait relations, Taiwan domestic politics, and U.S.-Taiwan relations. It's been great working with Jessica on this new report, which I highly recommend everyone take a look at in coming days. So once again, thank you all for joining today's event. And now I'll pass the mic over to Jessica to kick us off. Jessica, over to you.
Thank you, Dave. Good morning, everyone, and good evening to those in Taiwan, which I think the bulk of the panelists are actually located there right now. I'm going to do my best to try to summarize as concisely as possible the paper. But like Dave said, it's forthcoming and we'll be posting it on Atlantic Council's social media channels. And I hope to go more in depth in the conversation with my esteemed co-panelist. So the objective of the paper is to look at how Taiwan's approach to international space has changed over the year, especially under the Tsai administration and with the recent COVID-19 pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We wanted to focus on how it has adapted over the years to adjust to changing circumstances and cross-strait relations, providing an overview of the history, especially in the previous two administrations, and what that shows about China's strategy writ large towards Taiwan's international space, and how Taiwan has adapted to larger geopolitical trends. So first and foremost, what is international space and why is it important to Taiwan? International space would be broadly defined as Taiwan's participation and engagement with a larger global community. It's been a particularly important goal for Taiwan in the past few decades, since the space has been increasingly squeezed by the PRC in terms of poaching Taiwan's diplomatic allies, limiting its participation in critical international fora. Taiwan also wants to participate globally and have expanded international space in order to support its sovereignty and allow Taiwanese experts to contribute to critical global dialogue and information sharing on issues of global relevance, which I think we've all seen very clearly with the COVID-19 pandemic. And it also wants to be included in international economic fora to benefit from any associated gains from preferential trade agreements in these blocs. So I'm going to provide a quick overview of the history just to give a background for those that have not looked at this issue in depth. So in the aftermath of the Chinese Civil War was when competition over diplomatic allies between the ROC and the PRC began, over which constituted the real China, and both were unwilling to form official ties with a country that recognized the other, presenting capitals an either-or choice. Things started to shift after the passage of UN Resolution 2758, which shifted the China seat at the UN from the ROC to the PRC and led to the bulk of countries across the world shifting its recognition from the ROC to the PRC. Since then, Taiwan's prioritization has shifted to include greater flexibility on one China baselines and moves to diversify its focus to not just focus on traditional international governmental organizations, but also on non-governmental organizations, economic organizations, and to foster deeper ties with countries that it has unofficial relations with. So at the cusp of the turn of the millennium, under former DPP President Chen Shui-bian, Taiwan had lost a large number of its official allies and had alienated many of its traditional unofficial ones due to too aggressive an approach in this space, and was accused of being a troublemaker, due in part to PRC propaganda, and also that it played into checkbook diplomacy of essentially bribing countries to shift its relations. So the next section of the report covers Taiwan's approach in the previous and current administration, which provides an interesting case study in just how China looks at Taiwan and its international space. Essentially, it shows that whatever the tone of cross-strait relations is, expands into the international arena. So under the Ma administration, you see that under a common 1992 consensus baseline of one China, that Chinese forbearance for Taiwan's international space, or that China had forbearance for Taiwan's international space, allowing Taiwan to participate in a number of UN specialized agencies. It didn't poach its allies under a tacitly accepted diplomatic truth. And in the report, we highlight a fascinating case study of the Gambia, which cut ties with the ROC in, I think, 2013, but the PRC actually did not accept Gambia's request to formalize ties, showing that PRC core interests of Taiwan took precedence over efforts for MOFA, the PRC MOFA, to expand its official relationships. At the same time, under the Ma administration, Taiwan was able to sign FTA-like agreements with a number of countries that had existing FTAs with the PRC. So during that time, Taiwan more or less preserved the number of its official allies, expanded its space through participation at the WHA and the International Civil Aviation Organization for the 8 years under the Ma administration. But as we looked at 2016, a lot of the concerns that the approach fostered under the Ma administration put all the eggs in China's basket turned out to be true. There were concerns that that the PRC could weaponize its approach to international space against Taiwan more broadly, and this proved true with the election of Tsai Ing-wen. With Tsai's inability to reach a common one China baseline, we saw that China began to restrict Taiwan's international space and use it as punitive measures against the Tsai administration and the DPP. Taiwan has not been invited to the WHA since 2016. A number of its diplomatic allies have since been poached, and China has been squeezing Taiwan's international space in whatever avenues possible, including in a number of non-governmental organizations where it will enforce its one China baseline, enforce its rhetoric on Taiwan, and force even the smallest of nonprofits to fall in line with how it frames Taiwan as a part of the PRC. So that brings us to the present day and the dynamics of play, which we've seen with a hardened US view towards the PRC, a global pandemic, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We're seeing how this all plays into Taiwan's strategy for its international space. There's been an alignment and an emphasis on democracy and shared values between the Tsai administration and the Biden administration, which has only gained further traction due to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. There's been more robust public diplomacy efforts through social media, through Taiwan's social media presence, and public health diplomacy, including through hashtag campaigns that we saw during the pandemic, such as hashtag Taiwan can help and let Taiwan help. These show that because of Taiwan's public diplomacy efforts during the pandemic, Taiwan was able to showcase on the world stage that it can make functional contributions to global health and share its lessons learned from its effective management of the pandemic. And this garnered a greater support for inclusion into multilateral health fora, specifically the WHA. But notably, this was still not sufficient to regain Taiwan a seat at the table. There has also been support and sympathies for Taiwan that have played out through parallels drawn with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and a potential Taiwan contingency. But we've also seen enhanced ties in the lead up to the war with how the PRC took a hardline approach towards Eastern European countries. We cite the examples of how it overreacted to Prague fostering a sister city agreement with Taipei, as well as Lithuania and Taiwan's reciprocal representative offices, which for the first time used the name of Taiwan instead of the ROC, which saw the PRC levy a number of economic sanctions and against Lithuania. And the region has more broadly soured towards China due to its tacit support of the Russian invasion. But what has been interesting in these cases is that we have seen that countries, especially those in Eastern Europe and the Baltics, are willing to bear the brunt of any PRC retaliation. And some are able to do so because of their inclusion in multilateral organizations such as the EU and NATO, because it allows for solidarity and burden sharing. So we then go to talk about what this is going to look like moving forward with how Taiwan domestic political trends are looking and how the PRC approach towards hardening against Taiwan's international space will likely continue in the next decade or so, I would say. So we're seeing how we're seeing how identity trends in Taiwan domestic politics are shaping towards a more broader support for pan-green or parties that align with the DPP's approach to cross-strait relations. So China's strategy towards Taiwan's international space, as we've seen in the past 8 years, are likely to continue and harden. The other element at play here is the KMT, which performed really well in the local elections, but they're still struggling with their messaging on cross-strait issues with the 1992 consensus coming off as increasingly unviable to the Taiwan public. So how the KMT shifts its approach to cross-strait relations will be an important factor to look at. Whether it will be able to come to a commonality with the CCP will be an important factor, but broader trends in Taiwan are looking like there's greater support for a Taiwan-centric approach, and that Taiwan's international space then will continue to be squeezed by the PRC. So we move from there to talk about what approaches Taiwan can take to preserve and safeguard the existing international space that it can, and whether there are any pathways for it to expand its international space, given that cross-strait ties are looking like they're only going to get increasingly tense in the future. The report talks about increasing engagement with developing countries, particularly those in the global south. This opens doors to potentially shifting a critical voting bloc within the UN, which has seen which has openly backed the PRC in voting against Taiwan's participation within the UN. And we can do this through collaboration with US partners and allies, including through existing mechanisms, such as those outlined in the Taipei Act. Determined means for Taiwan to embed its participation in bilateral trade agreements and in international economic fora, and to and finally, one thing that we want to that we emphasized is that the global narrative on Taiwan should involve greater coordination against countries that have one China policies that do not align with the PRC one China principle, and just to push back against PRC discourse on the world stage, which has been the primary factor in justifying Taiwan's exclusion from a number of international fora. So the piece focused on major themes over the past 2 decades specifically, and given word limitations, we were unable to touch on certain elements and facets of Taiwan's foreign policy under Tsai. And I'm hoping that this will come up in the discussion with the other panelists. There's the case of Somaliland, which is unique in and of itself, given its similar status to Taiwan on the world stage. Factors also into an alignment of democracies and raises interesting questions about how Taiwan can combat PRC narratives of being anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, and push back against its foothold in the global South. And finally, there's the question of Twitter, which I think is in the front of our minds recently with Elon Musk at the helm. We saw how Twitter has been a successful vehicle for Taiwan to share its story, its messaging efforts, and its ability to engage with countries and other government officials, especially during the pandemic. And so this raises the question of how this will change moving forward. Will Taiwan accounts be affected? I think most recently, the Taiwan government account tags have been removed, and whether there will be a suitable alternative. So I'm looking forward to the discussion with the co-panelists.
Great, thank you very much for that, Jessica. We're really excited by what you put together and can't wait for that report to come out soon. Good morning, everyone. My name is Colleen Cottle, the Deputy Director of the Global China Hub. And today we'll be holding 2 panels with a short break in between them. The first panel is themed Taiwan's Quest to Expand its International Space, Successes and Failures, which gets to the heart of what Jessica's report's about. Over the last several decades, Taiwan's leaders have taken varying approaches to and achieved mixed results when it comes to preserving and expanding Taiwan's international space, be it through participation in international organizations or maintaining formal or informal bilateral ties. And the goal of this panel here is to draw from the expertise of our panelists to assess both the historical record and the current state of play in Taiwan's international engagement efforts. So in this vein, it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists and moderator. First, we have our moderator, Wen-Ti Song, who is a sessional lecturer at the Taiwan Studies of at Australia National University and a member of the Australian Centre on China in the World. His most recent publication is Taiwan, Renewing Faith in Liberalism and the Liberal International Order in the China Story Yearbook. Our first panelist, who you're familiar with at this point, is the report's author, Jessica Drun. Next, we're honored to have Shelley Rigger, who is the Brown Professor of East Asian Studies and the Vice President for Academic Affairs, Dean of Faculty at Davidson College. She is a non-resident fellow of the China Policy Institute in Nottingham University and a senior fellow of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. She's also director of the Taiwan Fund, an investment fund specializing in Taiwan-listed companies. Her most recent book is The Tiger Leading the Dragon: How Taiwan Propelled China's Economic Rise. Next is Sarah Newland, who is an assistant professor of government at Smith College. Her work has been published in Governance, Pacific Review, China Quarterly, and the Journal of Political Science Education. She is a fellow of the Public Intellectuals Program of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations and a member of the U.S.-Taiwan Next Generation Working Group. Next, we have Jacques Delisle, and he's the Stephen A. Kozin Professor of Law, Professor of Political Science, and Director of the Center of the Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania, and Director of the Asia Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. His writings have appeared in publications such as the Journal of Contemporary China, Asia Policy, China Review, among others. His most recent book is called The Party Leads All: The Role of the Chinese Communist Party in China's Politics, Governance, Society, Economy, and External Relations. And finally, we're thrilled to have James Lee, who is an assistant research fellow at Academia Seneca in Taiwan, and an affiliated researcher at the University of California Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation, where his research focuses on the United States' One China policy and the geoeconomics of US-Taiwan relations. Wen-Ti, thanks so much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Colleen, for that introduction. Let me begin by congratulating Jessica, of course, for this wonderful paper. Very succinct and goes into a lot of historical depth as well. I like how you were able to cover 5 successive presidencies and compare and contrast different strategies Taiwan has tried on cultivating international space. I also think that you did a great job, especially in terms of highlighting case studies like Gambia and Lithuania, for example. And I think the final point you raised about not getting bogged down in domestic politics in diplomatic allies societies is an important point as well for Taiwan going forward. And yeah, I think there are a lot of open questions, of course, when it comes to Taiwan's international space for Taiwan. How much space would be optimal in terms of, not so much in terms of how much does Taiwan want, but how much space is compatible with being able to be tolerated by China without crossing China's red line, but at the same time, maybe potentially useful for pushing the envelope a little bit as well in terms of moving that so-called red line, or if that red line is movable at all. I think these are a question that may be worth pondering at some point down the road. Of course, if we think about the timing, we are just past the 20-party Congress in China as well. Whether in light of Xi Jinping's work report at 20-party Congress, when he reiterated this seemingly need for more urgency on quote-unquote making progress on Taiwan, whether that's going to actually translate into a different level of patience on Taiwan, as well as different attitude on Taiwan's international space. I think that's quite an interesting topic that we'll get into perhaps during Q&A or during the panels as well. And lastly, I think Beijing, of course, is likely going to be facing catch-22 as we head into the 2024 campaign season in Taiwan. Because of this, it's almost a difficult situation for Beijing, because on the one hand, with this renewed sense of urgency about Taiwan, there may be more incentive for Beijing to try to pursue action that could perhaps lead to more hasty progress. But at the same time, it also knows from history, from previous lessons, whenever China tried to play a more active role in Taiwan's elections, it tended to invite pushbacks and help the electoral fortunes of parties that Beijing perhaps didn't like quite much. So these are all open questions, and that make this report by Jessica particularly timely as well. But in any case, I am very privileged to be able to invite our panelists to, of course, share their expertise and help us work together on thinking about Taiwan's international space. And without further ado, let me turn the floor over to our first panelist, Professor Shelley Rieger from Davidson College.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to see all my good friends. So thanks for inviting me and letting me get into this conversation. I'm just going to say a few words, because I know there's lots of speakers and listeners and questions. Just a few words about kind of the domestic side, the domestic political angle on Taiwan's international space. And I like it that Jessica's report goes all the way back to the beginning of the era when the Republic of China, which we know today as the Republic of China, Taiwan, was struggling to hang on to its position in the world as the recognized representative of China. So in the United Nations, and then in terms of many countries' specific national recognition. And, I think there was a period of time when, for many people in Taiwan, certainly the political class, the kind of ruling elite and their inner circle and even their outer circles of supporters, being recognized as the Republic of China was extremely important. And it was not possible to compromise on that principle. So, for example, when the Republic of China was on the verge of being replaced in the China seat in the United Nations by the People's Republic of China, there were conversations about the possibility of dual recognition. So maybe we could have, a seat for the PRC and a seat for the ROC, or maybe a seat for the PRC and a seat for some other entity representing Taiwan. And it was Chiang Kai-shek and his government that said, nope, we're not doing that, right? Either we're China or we're not. So that kind of hardcore determination to hang on to the legacy of the first half of the 20th century was a real missed opportunity for Taiwan to avoid the situation that it finds itself in today in terms of international recognition, because that was happening at a time when the PRC was not strong enough necessarily. Maybe it would have been. We never tested that question fully, but the PRC was not strong enough to exclude Taiwan in the way it does today. But I think part of the reason that Chiang Kai-shek was taking such a hard line was that there was a sense that, this was necessary for the legitimacy of the Taiwanese government itself to continue to hold its line on the identity of the ROC internationally, and that without the accompanying mandate to recover the mainland by the ROC for the ROC constitution, that there would be no rationale for the ROC state in Taiwan either. So, the domestic politics were driving, in short, even then. So after the U.S., in particular, after the U.S. announced that it was shifting its recognition toward the PRC, a process which took a long time, actually, from 1971 to 1979, people in Taiwan were pretty panicked. They really thought this is likely to be the end of the ROC and therefore the end of Taiwan as a freestanding, self-governing entity, because international recognition seemed so central to the survival of that state. However, as we all know, Taiwan has survived as a freestanding, self-governing entity, and the ROC state is still in existence in a kind of consistent form. It has evolved a lot, but it's still the same state as it was in the 1970s. And that, I think, is accompanied by a recognition in Taiwan, in both the political elite and among the population, that formal recognition as China was not actually essential to the survival of Taiwan as we know it, and that informal forms of recognition or unofficial forms of interaction were also feasible ways to keep Taiwan alive in the international community. So you see a kind of shift from the demand for formal recognition to, okay, well, so we can't be formally recognized by the US, but the Taiwan Relations Act will help us to have all of the substantive features of recognition without formal recognition. Nonetheless, even through the 1980s and 90s, there was a lot of desire in Taiwan for formal recognition. And the Taiwanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs worked really hard to sustain and build a sort of stable of diplomatic partners that would allow it to claim that the ROC still had international recognition. But I think what we've seen in the recent period, so really starting after the end of the Lee Teng-hui administration, Lee Teng-hui was pretty devoted to formal diplomatic relationships, and I think felt people at that time, people in the Lee administration, thought that they would pay a high political price domestically for losing international relationships, so losing those diplomatic partners. But since 2000, when Chen Shui-bian became president and through to the present, I think in terms of Taiwan's domestic politics, there's been a significant shift away from a kind of sense of crisis every time a formal relationship is severed to an understanding that as long as we have good substantive relationships with important countries, that's actually more important than these formal diplomatic ties. Last point, though. Formal diplomatic ties and more formal forms of representation in the global community still matter in Taiwan. If Taiwan were to lose all of its diplomatic partners, I think there would be a significant loss of public confidence in the future. And I think that could be one of the kind of tipping points that might surprise us in terms of what Taiwanese voters were willing to accept in exchange for security. With that, I'm signing off and excited to listen to everybody else.
Thank you, Shelley, for your very enlightening remarks. Next, I think we have on the queue Professor Jack Delisle, who will be sharing his insight with us.
Okay, well, thanks. It's a pleasure to be joining us today. A good late evening from Taipei. So I think this is a terrific report. I think Jessica's absolutely right that Taiwan's international space is intimately bound up with Taiwan's ability to survive and to be secure, and that Taiwan has pursued a remarkably consistent strategy at the broad level of trying to retain a degree of state-like stature in the international system with a lot of tactical adjustments. And I think it's one of the papers, the strength of this paper is the way in which she goes through how that basic goal has played out differently with different leaders and under different domestic and international circumstances. I think it's especially a useful summary on some of the earlier years, which tend not to get discussed quite so much, but are important background, and Shelley's just done a nice job of reviewing that. And I think it's important to see this continuity and to bring it out. So I'm going to shift now from the complimentary to the complementary and sort of add some things around the edges of what she says. I mean, I think if you want to take an even more 30,000-foot view of this, what the Taiwan strategy has been over this very long period, certainly during its democratic era, but also I think all the way back to the shift in the 1970s away from the ROC in Taiwan being China, is an attempt to maintain as much of the stature of a state and a government of a state in the international system as possible, because that's what gives you defense in this world. Westphalianism is still with us. Being a state is much better than not being a state. And indeed, perhaps the single greatest Westphalian power of the latter part of the 20th century and into the early part of the 21st century is China. Nobody cares more about sovereignty and Westphalian views than they do, so you're sort of playing on that deck if you do this. So how has Taiwan done that? And I think there are, depending on how you count them, 3 to 5 or so strategies that all have been part of the mix, and many of them are highlighted in the paper. First, formal diplomatic ties. As Shelley's pointed out, that was a big deal and it's waned some, but it is still there. And so what I'm going to do with each of these is suggest sort of where we are now and where we might go in the near future. So Taiwan's formal diplomatic recognition is under extreme pressure. Every time I go to the foreign ministry here, there are fewer flags in the lobby. Someday there's going to be one hapless person there holding one flag if the trends continue. And so that's going to be a strategy that I think has limited payoff. But for Beijing to squeeze Taiwan too hard on this is risky for Beijing's agenda. If you back Taiwan all the way into a corner, and the view still is formal ties matter, then you tempt Taiwan to take perhaps desperate measures if the other strategies aren't working to give it a degree of security. And Taiwan can code switch. Taiwan can say, hey, okay, the heck with diplomatic formal relations. What really counts is a robust participation in the international system in an informal way, and Taiwan can play that card quite successfully, and in some ways has strengthened in that regard. So that's the sort of second strand, or part 2 of the first strand, which is having robust informal relationships out there in the world, especially with To use a rude phrase, the countries that matter most. And in the world today, that's probably still the U.S. Certainly for Taiwan, it is very much the U.S. And Taiwan has been successful in building an extremely strong informal relationship with the U.S. You see this in any number of contexts, and just to take some examples from very recent times, we've had Biden say on 4 or 5 occasions that we will actually defend Taiwan and with force, and linking that to the Ukraine example, we've seen him say things like the sovereignty or the sort of status of Taiwan is up to Taiwan to decide. Now, both of those things are consistent with strategic ambiguity and with U.S. views in the Taiwan Relations Act and so on, but they are plucked out of context and said in a way that looks like stronger support for Taiwan. We can talk about the raft of congressional legislation that's come through, from the Taiwan Travel Act to several iterations of the National Defense Authorization Act, the Taipei Act, the Didn't Quite Make It Taiwan Policy Act, but there's at least half a dozen things that all signal this bipartisan cross-institutional strength of American recognition for and support for strong informal relations with Taiwan, and it's gone multilateral. Biden stands there with the leaders of South Korea, of Japan, of the G7, NATO. I mean, these are remarkable statements of the world is coming together to give Taiwan a kind of informal support and status it has not enjoyed for quite some time. And again, Russia's behavior in Ukraine and China's limitless friendship, which, by the way, does have limits, but the limitless friendship with Russia that I think has reinforced that tendency. There is the risk, and I think Shelley may be the originator of this phrase, there is the risk of loving Taiwan too much. That is, this kind of support can actually backfire. See, for example, the consequences of the Pelosi visit. That was a mixed blessing. But it's on the whole a pretty good story. But what's true in what's true in the informal relationship, I think, extends to what I'll now talk about, which are kind of strands 3 and 4, or second big strand, which is engagement with the formal structures of the international system. International organizations, not just countries and the diffuse clusters of them, but things like the UN, the WTO, all those kinds of entities. And there, of course, Taiwan has had some success, but has had some setbacks. Most notably the WHA, the ICAO, all that sort of stuff, where Beijing has tightened the screws. And for formal membership in international organizations, the prospects ahead are not good. For 2 reasons. China's determined to block it. And for another, there's not much growth of international organizations these days, except for ones that China's taking the lead in. CPTPP, Taiwan's applied, it's not getting in. China's not getting in. There's just not a whole lot of opportunity there. So that front looks kind of bleak. But the informal participation without membership, that's where the WHO and the ICAO fit in. Those aren't going to come back anytime soon either. But there are these more diffuse forms of engagement with and participation with international organizations that fall short of membership, and often these are international organizations that fall short of the full, robust versions that Taiwan used to pursue. So think of something like the Summit on Democracy, or the GCTF when it goes multilateral, the Global Cooperation Training Framework, and these other kinds of more ad hoc organizations, or ones where Taiwan is getting participation. Now, in this whole story that I've been telling so far, particularly the informal parts of relations with the U.S. and other relatively substantial powers on the one hand, and informal participation in international organizations which tend not to be of the UN one country, one vote type, where China can exercise a lot of leverage. In both of those, Taiwan is getting more standing, more stature, but with a smaller slice of the world. And it's a north-south divide to some degree. It's a kind of authoritarian democratic divide to some degree. So it's kind of a good news, bad news. The final strand that has been part of Taiwan's strategy quite successfully for a while has been to engage in what I call as-if participation. Taiwan does the kabuki of being as if it were a member of the UN Human Rights Conventions, as if it were a member of the UNFCCC on climate change, as if it were a full-fledged member of a whole bunch of international arrangements. And that works pretty well, and that strategy will continue to succeed to some degree simply because Taiwan can do that unilaterally. It doesn't require cooperation from anyone else. And here the recent changes in the world have given Taiwan new opportunities. COVID, Ukraine, right? Good citizen on public health, playing by the rules. Ukraine, we're for peace. We're for not using force to rearrange the de facto borders and even the de jure borders of the international system. And here, too, there's this split in that we're now seeing that kind of issue align more clearly on this ideational divide between the U.S. and China. Which side are you on in something that we don't want to call a Cold War, that's an exaggeration, but that's where the split lies. And again, Taiwan doing very well with one side and less well with the other. The last thing I'll say on this, though, is that there is another kind of back to the future element that I think has been added to the strategy. Maybe we can fold it under one of the existing categories, but I think it's a new thing of the moment. I started by saying it helps to be something like a state in the international system. Well, if you're thinking good old realist billiard ball kinds of states, it's all about survival, it's all about security, which means it's about security alliances. And there, what we've seen emerge, being reinforced by the Ukraine issue, being reinforced by China taking a more militarily threatening posture toward Taiwan, is that Taiwan is now being treated much more as if it were almost a treaty ally. And here the Ukraine thing has gotten complicated too. We've actually been at pains, the US government has been at pains to say, well, we drew a line between NATO formal treaty allies and mere friends like Ukraine, which draws a line about whether you actually get the troops involved, at the same time saying, hey, Taiwan's not a formal treaty ally, but the troops are going to be involved. So it's this really interesting move that raises Taiwan to this almost treaty ally, which takes us really back to the future, pre-79, pre-TRA, pre-canceling of the security treaty and normalization of relationships. So I think that's something to keep an eye on going ahead. And then the last thing I'll say is we do have risks beyond the ones that I've identified so far. One is, and Shelley touched on this, what goes on in Taiwan's domestic politics. Elections are scary things. And for the last 16 years, in America, they're especially scary. But for the last 16 years, the U.S. has been very fortunate, and Taiwan's been very fortunate, of leaders in Taiwan having safe hands and being largely trusted in Washington to be able to manage the cross-strait relationship as well as Beijing will allow Taiwan to manage it. Is that going to happen? We don't know. There are worries about some of the potential candidates on both sides. And one of the things I worry about having just watched the 9-in-1, the local elections here, is it's getting nasty. The polarization, the demonization of the other party raises the risk that we'll see rhetoric that Beijing could seize on as proving its point about how dangerous the situation is as Taiwan tries to slip away. And worse yet, we Americans are the black hands behind what's going on. The big question is, of course, China. How impatient is it? How much is the kind of thing we saw taking another twist up in the August 22 white paper, where, hey, the one country, two systems is working so great in Hong Kong, it's for you next. And the specific calling out and demonizing of the DPP by name as opposed to vague Taiwan independence forces. Plus, I think the genuine concern in Beijing that Taiwan is slipping away, salami tactics, doing things that are hard to draw a hard red line against. And so, it's a very bad vibe to be in. The news for Taiwan, I don't know if this is good or bad, it's a little bit of both, is that Taiwan has actually lost some agency in this. It can and should do all the stuff Jessica describes, but it has less control over its fate. It is much more a situation now where Taiwan will be the trigger, the flashpoint in a really bad U.S.-China relationship if it gets that bad, rather than being this sort of outside shock that triggers a deterioration in superpower relations. So that's kind of where we are. I think this paper is a really useful guide to how to navigate these treacherous waters, and I thank you for providing it to us.
Thank you, Jax, for that remark. I quite like your point about how Taiwan is becoming increasingly more powerful, but perhaps in a smaller slice of the world. And that gets to the point about GCTF as well. There's an increasing tendency in Taiwan to like exploring opportunities from multilateralism, if you will. Just last year, when AUKUS was all the rage, in not only Australia and US, but also in Taiwan as well. There were so many conferences and panels when people are talking about, is there room for Taiwan to join AUKUS as an observer or a partner or something else? So again, that goes to prove your point. Okay, so next up, may I invite Sarah? Professor Sarah Noonan is an assistant professor of government from Smith College, who will undoubtedly give us very interesting observations. So floor is yours, Sarah.
Great. Thanks, Professor Song. So I want to pick up a little bit on something that Shelley started talking about, which was this idea that good substantive, the idea of a recognition in Taiwan that good substantive relationships could be a partial, if not a complete substitute for kind of formal recognition of the ROC in institutions like the United Nations. And I want to sort of pull on this thread from the perspective of subnational politics. I think one thing that gets left out sometimes of this conversation about Taiwan's international space is the ways in which Taiwan engages with city, state, provincial level governments around the world, and how that can be a really important tool for preserving preserving relationships between Taiwan and some of its allies at a time at which the PRC is increasingly trying to sort of put pressure on and limit Taiwan's ability to participate either in formal international organizations or in, sort of formal ties, bilateral ties with diplomatic allies. And Jessica's report alludes to some examples of this. I think the example of Taiwan's mask diplomacy, the sort of Taiwan Can Help campaign during COVID, is a great example of a form of diplomacy that really was enacted via ties to state and local governments. So in the US, many of Taiwan's donations of masks and PPE were going from a sister city in Taiwan to its sister city in the United States, for instance. And so I think that these kinds of ties between, formalized government ties between Taiwan or subnational governments in Taiwan and their partners in the US and elsewhere is a really important tool. It's a tool that's especially powerful for connecting Taiwan to countries with federal systems, because those tend to be the places where subnational governments are really empowered to engage in meaningful policymaking, both in terms of economic policymaking, but also in terms of foreign policymaking. And so in the US, for instance, state governments often have an office that is responsible for managing international trade. Those offices often have longstanding and robust histories of engagement with Taiwan. So I want to talk a little bit about the kind of history of this kind of subnational engagement as a way that Taiwan has sought to increase and maintain its international space, and then also some of the kind of ways in which there are minefields or potential problems with that as an avenue of international engagement. So this is a strategy that I think the Taiwanese government really started to embrace in the 1980s in the wake of its loss in 1971 of the China seat in the UN, but especially in the wake of the 1979 normalization of relations between the US and China. Policymakers in Taiwan were very concerned, as Shelley was talking about, that was really going to spell the kind of beginning of the end for Taiwan. And so you started to see a really concerted effort to build relationships with state governments via encouraging states, incentivizing states to set up trade offices in Taiwan. They would have a staff member on the ground. This was supposed to create a meaningful avenue, both for encouraging trade relationships between the state and Taiwan, but also for allowing communication between the state government and officials in Taiwan. Governors were encouraged to visit Taiwan. Taiwanese politicians came to the US and sort of pled Taiwan's case, talked about the importance of supporting Taiwan to US audiences. And so these kinds of ties, I think, really were seen as a way to maintain connections to the US at a moment at which, there were real concerns about what the future of that relationship was going to look like. I think these continue to be important today. The forms that they have taken have really evolved over time. So now we see things like driver's license reciprocity agreements between now nearly every US state and Taiwan that make it pretty seamless to trade in your Taiwan driver's license for a driver's license in the US state that you move to, or vice versa. We see things like educational partnerships, especially these I think can be important in the wake of the closure of the Confucius Institutes across the United States, that the Taiwanese government is seeking to sort of make educational resources available, make Taiwan an alternative for American students who want to learn Chinese without some of the sort of freedom of speech limitations, political content limitations that people were concerned were associated with programs run by Confucius Institutes or funded by the Chinese government. And there are lots of other examples too. U.S. State governors visit Taiwan pretty regularly. These often wind up in the news because China hates these visits and objects pretty vociferously to them. And some of these I think are more sort of purely symbolic ways to show support for Taiwan, but some are really concrete programs that I think can build meaningful relationships between the U.S. and Taiwan. And I should say this is not just about the U.S. and Taiwan. Taiwan does this with other places as well, although I think there's probably room to expand some of those relationships into, to try to more fully develop them in other contexts. And, so I think that these can be important for sort of creating everyday familiarity, giving people in the United States a sense of the stakes of, why Taiwan is valuable. I think it can expose a lot of people to Taiwan and help them better understand, what it means to live with a great power threatening you in your backyard. And I think they also can bring really concrete resources around things like Chinese language learning and trade to U.S. cities and states. So, these relationships, I think, are in some cases they have been much less controversial or received much less sort of angry pushback from the Chinese government than Taiwan's attempts to participate in international organizations or to, engage in sort of national government to national government ties. So, for instance, the driver's license reciprocity agreements that I mentioned before, typically when those agreements are signed, there's really no reaction from officials in mainland China. There doesn't seem to be very much pushback against them. I haven't talked to any signatories of those agreements who reported any kinds of problems. Other kinds of subnational engagement do encounter the kind of resistance from the Chinese government and attempts to sort of limit them or punish participants that we might see with more national or international participation. So often governors' visits to Taiwan now are resulting, I think, increasingly in threats from the Chinese government to cancel investments in that state, to sort of warn Chinese companies away from working with that state. And so there are definitely, I think the Chinese government is using both carrots and sticks to try to limit this form of international engagement for Taiwan. In terms of carrots, they sometimes do things like offer a U.S. city that is in the process of signing a sister city agreement with Taiwan the opportunity to partner with a high-profile Chinese city if they cancel the agreement with Taiwan or don't sign it. And then the threats tend to be more along the lines of, threatening to cancel investment agreements and things like that. So, I think that we should expect to see that as Chinese pressure on Taiwan sort of ramps up in other areas, as China increasingly seems intent on shrinking Taiwan's space down to nothing, I think we should expect to see increasing pressure on some of these subnational forms of engagement as well. But I do think that they are an important sort of alternative avenue via which the US and Taiwan can engage in ways that can be really mutually beneficial. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah, for those comments. Definitely lots of interest in subnational diplomacy. And I would suggest that not only can level diplomacy go sort of vertically up and down, national versus subnational, but some researchers have suggested the possibility of going functionally from executive level diplomacy to perhaps parliamentary diplomacy as a way to explore potential more space for Taiwan, international space, so to speak. All right. So again, thank you very much for your great comments. Next up, we have Dr. James Lee, who is an assistant research fellow from the Academia Sinica, who will share his comments with us.
Thanks so much for having me and inviting me to this event. And I just want to echo all the other panelists and say that I really enjoyed reading this paper. And in particular, I really found the historical background and the context really helpful in bringing us up to speed about how we got from 1949 to where we are today, because so much of Taiwan's current predicament and Taiwan's current ambiguous status in international relations is Taiwan kind of still feeling the influence and the legacy of the Cold War. So having that kind of historical context is really helpful. So one question that I had from reading this brief, and it echoes something that Sarah brought up earlier about symbolism versus substance in U.S.-Taiwan relations, is how much of Taiwan's quest for international space is being driven by interest, material self-interest, as opposed to symbolism, because we discussed the reasons why Taiwan wants international space. I wasn't quite sure how to categorize those between some kind of symbolic issues, ideological issues, as opposed to Taiwan trying to achieve something for its kind of material self-interest. And there's a kind of debate in the United States right now about how much of U.S. policy towards Taiwan is just symbolic and how much of it is actually supporting Taiwan, and if those two goals are in conflict. And there's a kind of a parallel debate happening in Taiwan with regard to the government's cross-strait and international policy. And this isn't something that is specific to the current administration. You could go back to the Ma administration. There was a debate at the time about whether Ma's attempts to pursue rapprochement with mainland China by accepting the one China principle and pursuing cooperation, and then leading to the Ma-Xi summit and the photo ops, and whether or not those kind of symbolic gestures had come at the expense of Taiwan's security. And so this kind of the tension between symbolism versus interest is something that, regardless of which administration, which party is in power, is something that Taiwan always has to face. I was curious as to your thoughts about how much of this quest for international space is being driven by interest as opposed to symbolism. And a question I also had about kind of more recent developments in Taiwan's search for international space is to what extent has Taiwan been able to translate the global economy's dependence on TSMC into diplomatic leverage, given the formal and informal leverage that the Taiwan government has over TSMC. When Morris Chang, the founder of TSMC and Taiwan's ambassador to APEC, when he reflected on his experience, and he said that there were so many countries approaching him asking, can TSMC invest more in our country so that we can reshore manufacturing supply chains for semiconductors? And Morris Chang saying TSMC can't possibly invest in all the places where the investment is in demand. So has Taiwan been able to translate that into diplomatic leverage? There have been some signs that some people are thinking along these lines, or at least internationally, like Josep Borrell kind of made a reference to how the EU needs to do more to support Taiwan because, to put it bluntly, the EU needs Taiwan's chips. And during the auto chip shortage, all these Japanese and German and US companies going to TSMC asking them to prioritize chip production. That kind of reinforced the point that for the first time, I think probably in the history of Taiwan's relationship with the international community, Taiwan has real bargaining leverage over the United States, Japan, and Europe. And because this kind of conversation about Taiwan security is converging at the same time that technology has become a kind of a critical area of competition between the US and China. So have there been signs that the government is leveraging TSMC and using TSMC as a bargaining chip in its relations with the United States? Or has the government been kind of careful about not making this relationship seem too transactional? Something I'm curious about. And then a final question I had was about the Taipei Act, and the paper refers to it, but I was kind of curious about your thoughts about how much the Taipei Act has given Taiwan more space internationally, how much of an impact that has had. Because US officials refer to the Taipei Act, but I'm not really sure how much of a kind of discernible, concrete, tangible impact it has had on Taiwan's efforts to gain more international space. So those kind of three issues about interest versus symbolism and TSMC as bargaining leverage and the Taipei Act were all things that I'm very curious about. It'd be great to hear your thoughts on this.
Great. So much, James. I think that's an excellent segue really into the more Q&A portion of this event. So why don't we start there? So I think first question naturally goes to Jessica, just to jumping off from last question from James. How much do you think that the Taipei Act has converged into, I guess, as being an asset in terms of helping Taiwan to develop more international space? And also relatedly, to what extent has perhaps TSMC's global dominance been useful in terms of serving as a economic or rather diplomatic leverage for Taiwan?
Sure. And I will try to take a stab at all three of the questions, and I'm sure my co-panelists will piggyback off any of the ones that I don't fully cover. So in regards to the Taipei Act, I'm not sure there's that much publicly available information on its enforcement. I will say I think more can be done along the US supporting countries that work to foster deeper relations with Taiwan and to help Taiwan maintain its official diplomatic allies. I know one example comes to mind during the pandemic in which Taiwan was struggling with its vaccine diplomacy efforts, and a number of its diplomatic allies were, I guess, complaining, for lack of a better word, that they weren't receiving sufficient donations from Taiwan. I think there were some coordination efforts with the US there, but that also highlighted just how deep PRC pockets were going in these countries in terms of trying to sway countries in Latin America to switch relations based on the need for vaccines. I'm not sure there's other examples that have featured more prominently recently, and I'm curious to see what the other panelists have to say. On the question on symbolism versus substance, US policy towards Taiwan's participation, at least in the intergovernmental organization front, so the UN and its specialized agencies, has been in organizations in which sovereignty is not a requirement, in which Taiwan can make substantive contributions, substantive or functional contributions. So that's why the WHA, the International Civil Aviation Organization, features so prominently, because of Taiwan's robust experiences in global healthcare, in aviation safety, as it runs one of the major aviation hubs in the region. I guess more broadly, if we focus on the substantive side, at least in Taiwan's recent partnerships with Europe, with Eastern and Central Europe, I think the symbolic elements of being shared democracies have served as a foundation off which to build more substantive relations. We've seen Taiwan foster more economic cooperation with a lot of these countries. I think there's scholarship agreements between Taiwan and some Central European countries, including, because you raised the point of TSMC, including sharing information and technical know-how on semiconductors.
Yeah, just to weigh in on one piece of that, I think that Jessica's right about the kinds of areas where Taiwan can make substantive progress and engagement with these regimes. Yes, not being a member-only organization, not being a UN affiliated one, particularly, you got to clear that hurdle. The subtler hurdle is one where China doesn't have maximum leverage, so Taiwan was much better at keeping in organizations it was already a part of before the PRC joined, or whether it be simultaneous succession. That was a WTO story, and that might someday be the CPTPP story. But basically, Taiwan's had more success where one or both of two real-world conditions obtain. One is that the regime is woefully inadequate if Taiwan's not a member. I mean, can you really do a global trading regime that excludes Taiwan? That would be kind of tough, but you can do lots of other spaces like whatever. And that was the way the WHO sort of that story, because Taiwan is at the front line of disease vectors coming out of China with SARS and now again with COVID. The argument was more compelling, but it doesn't always work as the post-COVID WHO sessions have underscored. And as to the Taipei Act and a lot of the rest of the legislation, I mean, there's so many provisions in there, it's hard to know how you'd measure it. So the ones that are about providing material aid and all that, those get implemented. But the ones that say, oh, you should slap around small countries that threaten to switch diplomatic relations, I mean, that's, I don't think that changes much. I think it's just a signal of congressional views on that. And if Congress ever were to try to press the president to change in a substantive way, policy in a sort of highly visible way, I think you'd see a real pushback. They'd say you don't have the authority to do this, and even if you read literally, the text of a lot of these laws are mostly statements of policy and statements of what the U.S. should do, rather than purporting to require the president to say, send high-level officials of any particular designation to Taiwan.
Any thoughts from Shelley or Sarah or James?
I was curious about the impact of the Taipei Act and kind of in response to like a specific episode when John Hennessy Lyland, the U.S. ambassador to Palau, visited Taiwan to accompany the Palauan delegation to Taiwan, and it raises questions about whether or not this was still part of the One China policy. And it seemed like this was in fulfillment of the Taipei Act, but I wasn't sure if we can really draw the lines that kind of that clearly back to a piece of legislation leading to this kind of specific action by the United States.
Great. Okay, let me try to read out a question from the audience members. So there's a question about China's attitude, basically, and this one is more about how, all right, let me read it out. How can China be able to reunify with Taiwan given that tightened timeline? By that, I assume he or she meant the 2049 original, a great revival of the Chinese nation deadline, as opposed to perhaps the more 2027 or so, more another kind of deadline that a number of more military security people have been talking about. And basically question is about how feasible is the Chinese military attack on Taiwan, and versus how possible is it that Taiwanese will accept the possibility of a peaceful regime change or peaceful unification scenario. Any takers on that?
I mean, I guess that's kind of a domestic politics question. And since I put my stake in that turf early on, I'll take an initial stab at it. The broad majority of Taiwan's population has not been excited about unification or amalgamation with the PRC for a long time. But the current situation is, I think, qualitatively different in that the nature of the PRC itself has become even more unattractive to Taiwanese in the last, well, how long has Xi Jinping been in power? Really since about 2015, when I think Xi Jinping began showing more of the sort of nuances of what his leadership would be like. There's just been a substantially more attention to the PRC in recent years. So, people in Taiwan used to just kind of not really notice what was going on in the PRC much. There was a lot of economic back and forth, or there was a lot of economic activity going from Taiwan to the PRC. But since the middle of the Ma administration, I think there's been more higher visibility for the PRC within Taiwan, initially because the Ma administration allowed people and money from the mainland to come to Taiwan, where suddenly Taiwanese were confronted in a new way with the reality of the sort of size and velocity of the PRC. But even after Tsai Ing-wen became president and a lot of that activity shut down, there's still, Taiwanese people understand what's going on in mainland China, and it's not appealing. Add on top of that the developments in Hong Kong, which, as Jacques alluded to, really undermine any sense that maybe one country, two systems has some potential as a formula for peaceful integration or, some kind of political unification that doesn't equal annexation of Taiwan by the PRC. Even that no longer seems like an attractive option. So it's hard to see from the point of view of Taiwan's domestic political preferences how Taiwanese could accept unification under the PRC current leadership. But I also think it's important not to kind of dismiss the possibility of change in mainland China. Mainland China has changed for the worse in recent years. It could also conceivably change for the better in the future. So part of the reason that I believe very strongly that we need to deter, prevent, postpone, avoid military conflict in the Taiwan Strait is that I do not rule out the possibility that the world could change in ways that would allow for a peaceful future in the Taiwan Strait. So there's a certain amount of energy, I think, in some quarters in the US to kind of like get this war over with. And I just think that's a terrible idea. And I think anybody who watches the news and sees what's happening to human beings, civilians in Ukraine, should be able to recognize that the most important objective always has to be avoiding military conflict.
Just on the timeline question, I think it's really two different questions that get mushed together more than they should. So you hear things like the Phil Davidson 2027 speculation. That is Defense Department thinking, and rightly so. The question is, when will China have the capacity such that it could plausibly think that if it goes, it could win, or at least, get far enough? Having the capacity tells you very little about whether China will act. China can wait long beyond it has the capacity, the time it has the capacity, if it doesn't feel that it needs to. If it feels like the status quo is tolerable. On the other hand, there's a really good chance that China would move sooner than it has the chance to act if it believes that a window is closing, and that window closing could be that Taiwan's going to do something that is sort of irretrievably going away, and so there the question there on the will side, the risk is the mast binding behavior of Xi Jinping and other leaders. So to the extent it is bound up with some deadline, it can't be passed on generation to generation, or it's essential to the achievement of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. Fortunately, those are kind of vague terms, but if you peg it to something which has some real meaning, and you say if we don't achieve this by X, then we've lost our legitimacy, you've kind of painted yourself into a corner where it's difficult to pivot away from that. Now, don't underestimate the ability to pivot. I think Shelley just made an excellent point about the long-term major developments inside China, but on policies that we thought were pretty darn deeply entrenched, zero COVID, something can happen and it can change pretty quickly if the calculus shifts. So for that more sort of small-scale reason, I would second what Shelley said, that it is important to try to structure China's behavior through getting the incentives right, whether it's deterrence or in Taiwan's case, allowing a bit of an off-ramp sometimes.
All right, sorry, Sarah, please.
Sure. I was just going to add to Shelley's comments that I think it's important to remember that right now, the vision of unification that the PRC is offering, and which has zero appeal, I think, to citizens in Taiwan, is a very narrow vision, right? It is essentially just one country, two systems, Hong Kong style, which from the perspective of some PRC leaders, sort of bafflingly to many of us, seems like a success. And I think certainly to many people in Hong Kong and to people watching from Taiwan, seems like a terrible tragedy. This was not, the only option that has ever been on the table for what a future relationship between Taiwan and the mainland might look like. And so, I think that Xi Jinping won't be in power forever, but, so in addition to imagining possibilities for political change within China, I think we also have to hold on to the possibility of a broader range of visions of what a future relationship between Taiwan and the mainland might look like, right? So I don't think people in Taiwan want to be part of a province of China, but you could imagine something more like a federation or a looser relationship that might be palatable at some point in the future. At this point, that doesn't seem like something that PRC policymakers consider to be on the table, but it is something that might have been on the table at some points in the past and might again be on the table in the future, perhaps.
Thanks. Actually, on that issue as well, I was wondering, in terms of, I guess, will obviously shifts, like Jack's mentioned as well. So it's not just about capabilities, it's also about will. But let's shift from security back to diplomatic or international space. Are there any kind of conceivable change in Taiwan or Beijing that could lead to a higher Beijing's tolerance level for more international space for Taiwan that we can think of? Especially given domestic politics in Taiwan as well, with how it's increasingly difficult, I guess, for DPP, but a number of other parties to have a endorsed Beijing version of 1992 consensus. So what room for more Beijing tolerable international space expansion is there for Taiwan?
Just my 2 cents on this. I think it's unlikely that Taiwan would be able to gain much more international space by conceding to Beijing's conditions of accepting the One China principle or the 1992 consensus. So I think the time of the kind of the Ma era kind of diplomacy with mainland China is now past. And what we've seen recently is quite alarming is that Beijing has taken a much harder line on certain issues, in particular, taking a much harder line on the moderate faction of the KMT, the Bantu Pai. The way that their rhetoric has been talking about how the moderates in the KMT are secretly pursuing Taiwan independence and they're dangerous, so that kind of thing makes me really worried about them taking a much harder position on the KMT. And makes me think that even if in the future there were a KMT administration that accepted the One China principle, that Beijing wouldn't give Taiwan much more international space because it could think that the KMT would be using that as a cover for advancing an independence agenda. So this is kind of something that I'm very concerned about.
I think one thing that's important to keep in mind that we haven't really talked about on this panel is the sort of domestic politics within China. We've talked about domestic politics, obviously, in Taiwan, but I think for individual officials in the Chinese system, there's not very much incentive to be like the guy who's nice to Taiwan. And so I think that this comes up certainly in the context of the subnational diplomacy that I talked about. I think if you're, working at a Chinese consulate in the US, you have every incentive to try to prevent cities and states from partnering with Taiwan, right? Because if you're perceived as not being sufficiently tough on Taiwan, perhaps that's going to negatively impact your own, sort of career prospects. And so I think it's important to remember that in some ways, the Chinese political system is a very strong top-down unitary system, but also there are lots of individuals who are making decisions here and making decisions about what's best for their own careers. And as long as they perceive, the sort of mood in Beijing to be one of, a very forceful, restrictive approach to shrinking Taiwan's international space, I think that's what is that's how like individual officials are going to interpret their sort of brief. I don't know that there's exactly a solution to that, but I do think it's something that's important to keep in mind.
Right. So yes, definitely for in terms of personal political security for many officials, they'd rather be 民左务右, right? Or you'd rather be too hawkish rather than risk being seen as too dovish. So definitely excellent observations. I have a question from the audience. To what degree do the panelists believe the dynamics of Taiwan's position might change once TSMC's $40 billion investment in new facility in the US materializes? Would that reduce US dependence on Taiwan, but not TSMC?
I can answer that. So I think it will reduce US dependence on TSMC to some extent, but not completely. And the government has in Taiwan, specifically Wang Meihua, the Minister of Economic Affairs, and Susan Tang, the Premier, they have given public assurances that the most advanced technology will not go to the United States. And the government has the ability through the Investment Commission to block any investments that it doesn't approve of. Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of National Defense both get to weigh in on these kinds of decisions by a private company to invest abroad. And if you kind of track the TSMC's announcements about what will be built, starting when, in which year, and you can kind of follow what's happening in Taiwan, there's kind of a pattern in which the US is getting increasingly advanced technology from Taiwan, but it's never at the cutting edge of what exists within Taiwan. So TSMC is going to build a 3-nanometer facility in Arizona, but at the same time, TSMC has been rumored has already started building plans for building a 1-nanometer facility in Taiwan and 2-nanometer facility. So, so in this way, Taiwan is able to give the US what it wants without giving away its most important kind of bargaining chip in the end. So I think that you will see less of a dependence on TSMC, but TSMC is still going to be a very important company, and Taiwan in particular is going to be very important for U.S. interests in this area.
Any other panelists want to jump in on the TSMC issue? Okay, I got one more question from the audience. What about the degree to which Taiwanese officials are manipulating U.S. leaders, especially in Congress, to upgrade our treatment of the island? The old China lobby may have disappeared, but it seems that we may be underestimating the degree to which Taiwan is using U.S. political situation to its advantage. So a question about U.S. domestic politics and room for maneuver, I suppose.
Yeah, I'll say something about that, which is that if Taiwanese officials are manipulating people in Washington are also manipulating Taiwan policy for their own political advantage, right? So there is a long-standing critique of Taiwan, which is in many eras well substantiated. Lee Dong-hui gets mentioned again this morning. Those of you with long enough memories, of whom I think only Jacques and I are members of that tribe, will recall that this whole brouhaha in the 1990s about a lobbying firm in Washington, D.C. called Cassidy and Associates, which they got paid by the Taiwan government to do some stuff that the questioner is probably thinking about the kind of stuff that they were doing. And so this isn't new. I think what is new is that for U.S. politicians in the past, responding to those kinds of pressures was mainly about kind of demonstrating their ideological purity to a certain kind of constituent, especially during the Cold War, when we were still, in that sort of Cold War mode. And also it was about appealing to a small but vocal constituency, even in some U.S. electoral districts, of Taiwanese Americans who were very motivated to, they were single issue voters on the Taiwan thing, and you could win their support fairly easily by, taking what they told you was the right position on Taiwan. Then we went through this period where there was a big gap between what the Taiwanese government was trying to promote in the US and what Taiwanese constituent groups, including FAPA, the Formosan Association for Public Affairs, were promoting. And so there was a period of, especially during the Chen Shui-bian administration, a lot of confusion in Washington. Who's actually speaking for this government? Is it TECRO, their official representative office? Is it the DPP office? Is it these citizens organizations that are coming at me from my district? They're all asking for something different. So there's a lot of history here. What I see, though, today is that as U.S.-China relations have become more negative, and as taking a hard line on China has become a more powerful way within U.S. domestic politics to show your toughness at a very low cost to politicians, they've turned their attention to the Taiwan issue as a venue for expressing that toughness with very little understanding, or, as far as I can tell, interest in understanding what is actually at stake for Taiwan. So yes, there may be Taiwanese voices that are trying to influence US politicians and policy in a particular direction, but I don't think that is necessarily the driver of things like the Taiwan Policy Act. I think the driver there is the desire to demonstrate a certain kind of political stance within US domestic politics. And Taiwan is just kind of the collateral I would say, collateral damage in many ways in that sort of internal thing a domestic thing that's happening in the U.S.
I agree with everything Shelley said. I would say one of the things she points to is a dynamic that has changed. Taiwanese, where's the line between manipulating and simply pressing for your interests? I mean, everybody does that in diplomacy. But I'm not sure that on the Taiwan side they adjusted sufficiently quickly to how much they're pushing against an open door instead of a closed door. And you run the risk of sort of falling on your face if you do that. And we're used to talking about the need to walk back statements by presidents or secretaries of state who didn't get quite the memo on what the catechism is about how you talk about the Taiwan issue, right? Call it a state or something like that, right? Now that those little changes in rhetoric, I think, matter less because the whole atmosphere is so poisoned. But when you get members of Congress doing that, the opportunities for them to do things which muck things up in a way that makes life difficult for Taiwan and the U.S. Is greater. And I think, we've seen talk about the reverse manipulation. It was not an unmitigatedly good thing for Pelosi to come to Taiwan, nor will it be for McCarthy to come here. Those are things that are not being done entirely out of pure motives for Taiwan's interests or out of sensible assessments of what will serve Taiwan's interests.
And just to
Thanks very
piggyback
much.
on, Jessica, go.
Yep.
Sorry, I just had a quick two finger. And I guess one thing that I would stress is just a lot of the statements we're seeing coming out of US politicians, especially members of Congress. There's a contradictory element to it because individuals will talk up their support for Taiwan and Taiwan's democracy and Taiwan as the anti-China, for lack of a better word. But what we're seeing in policy doesn't always play out. And I think this is the most clear cut with the previous administration, with, there are certain elements of the America First faction that Taiwan wants international space. And with that, it needs multilateral support, including from the US, through investments in the UN by putting leadership from countries, from Western countries and its allies in key positions in the UN to help find ways that Taiwan can participate through funding to counteract China's major funding schemes within the UN. But we're seeing people that talk up how important Taiwan is withdraw funding, withdraw emphasis on multilateralism. And so there's an inherent contradiction there that I'm not sure Taiwan is clear cut to navigate moving forward.
Right. So thanks very much, everyone. Unfortunately, that's our time. So let's all take a break for a few minutes, and we will, of course, thank all our excellent panelists, of course, for giving us such insights. And we will take a break and reconvene by about 10:30, and for the panel 2 on U.S. and Europe cooperation, as well as other allies cooperation on ways forward for Taiwan.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm excited to introduce our incredible second panel, which will examine the way forward for U.S. and European engagement with Taiwan. It is a particularly important time for the United States, Europe, and other allies and partners to look at aligning their policies on Taiwan. As Jessica expertly details in her report, geopolitical developments, such as Russia's invasion of Ukraine, has raised Taiwan's profile, particularly in Europe, where many have drawn parallels between Taiwan and Ukraine. However, the need for policy alignment predates that war, which I'm sure our panelists will also touch on. With this, it's my pleasure to first introduce our panelists and moderator. First, our moderator, Marie Jourdain, who is a visiting fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. Before that, she worked for the French Minister of Defense, Directorate General for International Relations and Strategy. There, she served at the North American desk, focusing on U.S. defense policy with Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. And she also served on the French Joint Staff on military cooperation with the US and UK. Shifting gears to our panel, it is my honor to introduce Frank Kramer, who is a distinguished fellow and board director of the Atlantic Council. Mr. Kramer has served as a political appointee in 2 administrations, including as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. At the Department of Defense, Mr. Kramer was in charge of the formulation and implementation of international defense and political military policy with worldwide responsibilities, including NATO in Europe, the Middle East, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Next, we have Yunyu Chen, who has been the London correspondent for Taiwan's Central News Agency since July 2021. Previously, she was the agency's foreign affairs correspondent in Taipei. Before joining the agency, she was a reporter and program host at the Russian Service of Radio Taiwan International, as well as a Russian language instructor at the National Defense University in Taiwan. She has a master's degree in history from Moscow State University. Next, we have Mikhail Tim, a research fellow at the Association for International Affairs in Prague. He was most recently the Czech cyber attaché to the United States. He has a master's degree from National Chengchi University, and his research focuses on foreign policy of China, foreign and security policy of Taiwan, and the role of the US in East Asia. Previously, he was involved in various research projects commissioned by the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs, mostly on the foreign and security policy of Turkey and energy security. And finally, we have Petr Tuma, who is a visiting fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. He is a Czech career diplomat with expertise on Europe, Middle East, and transatlantic relations. He previously worked at the Czech Embassy in Washington, D.C. He has also served as the deputy chief of the Czech Embassy in Syria and in Ramallah, Jerusalem. Before joining the Czech Foreign Service, he taught philosophy and anthropology at Charles University in Prague. Marie, thanks so much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Hello, thank you, Colin, for your remarks. And let me start also by welcoming our great panelists for this second round of discussion this morning. It was a fantastic first panel, so we've got a lot of pressure here. But this one will be very much focusing on the way forward for US and European engagement with Taiwan. And so before turning to you, to our panelists, let me maybe introduce a bit this discussion by a brief overview of the engagement of Taiwan in Europe. There is only one European country that has full diplomatic ties with Taiwan, which is the Vatican. But one can only observe that from all the diplomatic offices Taiwan has across the world, the continent hosting the most of them is actually in Europe, while the one country hosting the most of them is the United States, making the transatlantic relationship in that context very much relevant and critical. More than that, the active diplomacy through the use of social media and the promotion of Taiwanese successes resonate particularly in Europe. Not recognizing Taiwan does not prevent American and European high-level engagements, which became more regular these last few years. We have all in mind the August visit of Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan, we mentioned in the previous panel, but we can mention also the visit of European lawmakers last month, meeting the president. The European Parliament's Committee on International Trade is also sending a delegation for the very first time next week in Taiwan, while the very first visit of European Parliament delegation took place only 30 months ago, with the objective to build, and I quote, a much stronger EU-Taiwan partnership. And so while the European Parliament has been quite active, it is important to notice that it's not alone and that other EU institutions, including the Commission, endorsed the Parliament's report on Taiwan at the end of last year. European states, and not just within the EU, are also assessing that their policy with China in a fast-changing strategic context and the strategy of engagement with Taiwan fits in this strategic thinking. And there are differences across Europe in that regard, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion on the different approaches and what priorities to pursue across Europe and with the United States. And so while the United States' concerns over the preservation of the status quo in Taiwan have been rising for a long time, the evolution appears much more recent in Europe. European concerns regarding Chinese policy, not only domestic, but also in the way it behaved abroad, including in Europe, are only growing. And this awareness may provide an opportunity or even maybe a challenge for Taiwan in its engagement with the transatlantic community. So a lot is on the table here, and I would like first to give the opportunity for each of our panelists to give their opening remarks, and from there we will be able to have a conversation. I welcome the questions, of course, of our online audience, so do not hesitate to use the Q&A. And without further delay, let me turn to start with an Atlantic Council Distinguished Fellow and Board Director, Franklin Kramer.
Thanks very much, Marie, and thanks, Colleen, also. The first panel was really excellent, so maybe we can meet their standard. I think when we talk about the way forward for the US and Europe for Taiwan, we'll see that there are some significant common approaches, but there are also some real substantial areas of differentiation. And I want to run through three broad areas, some military aspects or security aspects, trade, and then issues with respect to the global South. I think we can all agree in the United States and Europe that the overall objective is in common, maintain peace and stability over the Taiwan Strait. It's in the recent G7 communique and in a bunch of bilateral communiques, and pretty strong language that the PRC should not unilaterally change the status quo by force. In the context of the Pelosi visit, the G7 said no justification to use a visit as a pretext for aggression. So again, from the objective point of view, the ends, if you will, of strategy, I think we are strongly in agreement. But when it comes to implementation, I think there's a high degree of differentiation. And most obviously, the United States has significant military components to its strategy. And not only significant, but actually they're going to increase. That's implicit, of course, in the US national security strategy, seeing China as the pacing challenge. But more specifically, the 2023 National Defense Authorization Act, not yet passed, but probably in the next few days, adds both requirements and resources to support with respect to Taiwan. So there's additional requirements about effective planning. There are additional requirements with respect to supporting critical infrastructures and the like, but most dramatically, perhaps, resources. The Act provides, or authorizes, I should say, $2 billion a year for the next 5 fiscal years through 2027 for weapons procurement. There is a contingent requirement, and that is the money is only available if Taiwan increases its own defense budget. Additionally, there's $100 million a year for 10 years for what's called a stockpile. It's really a munitions stockpile in the event of an actual contingency. And then another $2 billion in loans if Taiwan chooses to take advantage of it. Europe obviously doesn't have anything comparable. It doesn't have a Taiwan Relations Act. It hasn't undertaken military contingency planning, but it's done more than nothing. And it's easy to forget, but one aspect for sure is the recent AUKUS agreement, which involves not only Australia, but from the European perspective, the UK. It doesn't include Taiwan, but it's counter China, so to speak. But the contingency that it's really all about is the Taiwan contingency. And then additionally, there's a significant amount of European naval presence from time to time in the overall Indo-Pacific, and specifically through the Taiwan Strait. So France, Germany, the Netherlands, the UK, among others. And then, as was talked about on the first panel, and Marie's already alluded to, a good deal of, I'll call it diplomatic activity with respect to Taiwan coming out of Europe, Lithuania, of course, the European Parliament, not only the people coming to Taiwan, but also various reports. Individual countries, so the Baltics, Czech Republic, France, Germany, Slovakia, and others, Sweden. So there's a lot of interaction, if you will. But the real question is sort of next steps. And I think when we think about next steps, it's pretty clear from a US perspective that we're looking at a high concern that the PRC might try to change the current relatively stable, depending on how you look at what happened after the Pelosi visit, situation. So the Secretary of State, for example, has been quoted as saying, and if I can read it, a fundamental decision made by the PRC that the status quo was no longer acceptable and that Beijing was determined to pursue reunification on a much faster timeline. I think that really changes how one has to think about things. And so from a US perspective, we need to help Taiwan establish an effective defense. Some people have called it a porcupine defense, a variety of weapon systems, unmanned vehicles in the air and under the sea, mines, air and missile defenses, cybersecurity and the like. There also needs to be a greater degree of contingency planning with Taiwan, and that ideally would include allies, especially in the Pacific allies like Japan and Australia. There's some very hard issues to deal with, like blockade, where I don't think anyone has quite sorted out the right answer. And it's important also for Europe, if you will, or individual countries in Europe, depending on how it comes about, to stand up and say that if the PRC, utilize force, that Europe would take significant action, whether that's sanctions or some other significant action, I think needs to be thought through and talked about. There's also a gray area where Taiwan could use support. We see a lot of pressure. Cybersecurity is an issue for Taiwan. Election support's an issue, counter disinformation. Both the United States and Europe can work in those areas. And then trade. We now have what's called the Chip 4 Alliance, which is Taiwan, the United States, Japan, and South Korea. It's an alliance in name. The question is whether or not it can really become an alliance in fact. And the whole issue of whether or not Taiwan can be more substantially involved in the supply chain, particularly information technology supply chain, is something that needs to be looked at. Europe can play a significant role in all those areas. And one area I think that opens up some opportunities is implied by what happened at the recent Trade and Technology Council agreement between the United States and Europe. There, the parties, that is, say, the United States and the European Union, established what they call the Digital Infrastructure and Connectivity Initiative. And they undertook to provide to two countries, those happen to be Jamaica and Kenya, additional support, digital support in Jamaica, connecting 1,000 or so public schools, expanding support for teachers, expanding support for small and medium enterprises, and the like. Taiwan could be very active, either directly with the TTC or in a supporting role, to demonstrate and work with countries in the global south in particular, how to utilize, expand, and make better use of digital connectivity. So this is something I think that could be looked at, for example, in Africa, in countries like Bangladesh. And then in addition, we all know that there's a strong impetus to move a great deal of capability respecting information technology out of China, some into India, some into other places. And again, Taiwan obviously having some of the leading, perhaps the leading company in that regard could be very involved in having TSMC be engaged in that. So let me stop there. I think there's a lot of opportunity for Europe and the United States to engage together with Taiwan and a lot of constructive possibilities. Thanks, Marie.
Thank you so much for these very insightful remarks. I already have so many follow-ups, but I would just say that I think it's remarkable that you quote the G7 statement, because the EU was actually unable to have a statement because of divisions within the EU. And I would also add that in my perspective, like the US approach, it's quite clear, like it's both about deterring China, but also like really helping to build a Taiwanese resilience. And there's definitely a lot of room for transatlantic cooperation on this. But without further delay, let me turn to Yunyu Chen, London correspondent for the Central News Agency of Taiwan, for her remarks.
Thank you so much for inviting me to share my observations on the ground. So my remarks are not very long, but I will start with saying that due to multiple external and domestic factors to a lesser degree, the attention towards and support for Taiwan from the international community has indeed increased during the last few years. I would separate these countries which have stepped up support for Taiwan recently to two categories. The first one, it is countries whose relationship with Taiwan, due to difficulties resulted from Cold War history, lack of knowledge, and so on, could hardly be characterized as robust or particularly promising. I would put the Central and Eastern European countries to this category. And the second one, countries which, in the perception of many Taiwanese, although big and important, tended to be careful about not upsetting China and thus undermining their own commercial and other practical interests, and keeping Taiwan at a certain distance as a solution to the tricky situations. And to this category belongs the UK, where I'm based. Generally speaking, in terms of enhancing or nurturing engagement with Taiwan, each category of countries should have its own strategy and approach. In the case of Britain, where I'm based, I would suggest that in a presumably US-led effort, more to be done in raising the public awareness about the interference and influence campaigns of the Chinese Communist Party and the often overlooked role in them of Chinese nationalism. And also more should be done in enhancing the UK's capabilities vis-a-vis China. Taiwan has useful experience and expertise to share, not least in the field of Chinese language education. Besides the already existing programs, Taiwan should be encouraged to come up with even more proactive and creative mechanisms for offering its knowledge and expertise. As to the Central and Eastern European CEE countries, with which Taiwan has begun to develop closer ties recently, I think even more needs to be done, including from Taiwan's side. Although it's widely assumed that there's a firm ideological common ground between Taiwan and these countries, I think it would be dangerous to underestimate the potential impact of certain factors on their bilateral relationship. And these factors include, but are not limited to, for example, the complex nature of the past and present of CE countries, the political electoral demand for securing tangible results or significant economic benefits from developing bilateral ties with Taiwan. And the lack of knowledge about each other that can easily lead to misinterpretation and probably unrealistic expectations. It goes without saying that when developing stronger ties with Taiwan or stepping up support for Taiwan, these countries often risk triggering negative reactions from Beijing and incidentally intensified Russian information warfare aimed at amplifying divisions in the target society and against the West and its allies. As in the case with Lithuania and even Ukraine. Both sides, Taiwan and CEE countries, can expect to enjoy solid long-term relationship when ideological kinship is backed up by real common interests, such as cooperation in developing supply chain resilience and market diversification. It's worth mentioning that Russian factors shouldn't be overlooked, even in the case of assessing the dynamics of the relationship between Taiwan and CEE countries.
Thank you so much, Yuan, for your remarks. And it's really striking to see that for a very long time, like you said, European states were really pursuing the strategy of not offending China. And even though you had this evolution, the change of status quo and Chinese policy that really bring awareness across European countries and making them adapt their strategy. And it's a very fascinating evolution within European states in the last year of relationship. But now it's time for me to turn to our third panelist, Michael Tim, a research fellow at the Association for International Affairs. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mary, and thanks to Atlantic Council for having me. I will begin with a statement that will probably shock you very much. The change in policy across the EU and in the EU is the pace is very slow. And now breathe in, breathe out to sort of deal with the shock, but that's just how the politics roll here. However, it is at the current time, at least, moving in sort of, I would say, at least from the perspective I'm taking, in a good direction. The big question for the future is what position Germany will take. I will commit a few minutes to that at the end of my introductory remarks. But let me for a while sort of descend from this like high level strategic level and tell something maybe more from personal micro perspective. And what my resume doesn't say is that between 2016 and this November 2022, I was a China analyst at the Czech National Cyber Information Security Agency. So as a government employee on relatively junior level, I sort of was a witness to a switch of Czech government attitude to China and also sort of emerging closer relations with Taiwan. And there's a couple of factors why that happened, but on a more micro level or more like what's going on also not in Central and Eastern Europe, but I would say generally across most of the European countries, is that there is a bit of generational change in the community of China researchers. The younger generation tends to view China, let's say, a bit more pessimistic attitude because their formative years during their formative years, the China was no longer this paradise of ever increasing business opportunities, but started to slowly emerge as a security threat or let's say at least a challenger to the world as we know it. And now, if you're sitting in the US, you may think, oh yeah, a bunch of junior China analysts sort of joining government ranks. That doesn't mean much, except very often, at least in Europe, those people usually will be the only ones in their respective departments with that particular policy agenda, and therefore their influence on sort of agenda setting and then sort of moving that up the decision-making chain is could be significant. So this is sort of like micro factor in how the views, and I think that plays some role, just not totally able to quantify it, that plays some role in how the European view of China is changing, and especially within various government departments. But China, Beijing is also very helpful in that respect, and I can mention the very counterproductive. You could even say arrogant reactions, arrogant approach of Beijing to countries like Sweden and Lithuania and also Czech Republic. And the problem for Beijing is when the number of those countries are growing, they're no longer the solitary troublemakers that rock the boat for everyone else. And for example, the case of the Lithuania. So when Lithuania changed the name of the Taiwan's representation office from Taipei to Taiwan, which if you ask me, totally makes sense. The pushback that Lithuania received from the rest of the EU members was mostly about that it was not consulted and it was sort of rushed and announced without any sort of discussion prior to that. But very, very few voices saw the reaction of Beijing as in any way legitimate. So Lithuania is not sort of seen as the country that makes troubles in this case. Maybe the announcement was to some level unfortunate or unfortunately implemented, but the reaction of Beijing is clearly seen as overreaction. What's also not necessarily great for Beijing, that the more Beijing pushes across Europe, the more various policymakers and politicians in need to sort of explain, especially when Beijing pushes back and say, hey, you are violating One China policy, and One China policy means that Taiwan is part of the People's Republic of China, and then the reaction is, wait, that is not our One China policy, that is One China principle, and this is not what we sign up for. And I'm not exactly sure if this is if this is the discussion Beijing wants to have out there, so that the countries feel the need to sort of push back on that and say this is not what we understand under One China policy. Every country has its specific One China policy, right? So that's how China is being helpful. But Taiwan is attractive in and of itself. I can tell from the perspective of cybersecurity that there is a significant demand from European countries to cooperate Taiwan on issues of common interest in cybersecurity area and disinformation. It is a trusted partner on technical policies or technical issues or policy issues like 5G. When we in Europe started to have the discussion whether to allow Huawei and ZTE, Chinese companies, into our future 5th generation mobile networks, then suddenly we realized, hey, wait a minute, there is this country that already did that when they are building 4G. Maybe we should talk to them, what's their perspective, what they think about it. And of course, there's also that great moment when when European countries realize that TSMC is actually a really important company, and it's also a very important Taiwanese company. And now everyone and their dog want to have a TSMC fab in their backyard. So there's this like competition when delegation after delegation coming to Taipei and pleads for the next TSMC factory to be opened in their country. So that helps too. And then, of course, I would be amazed if I didn't mention some impacts of the Ukraine conflict. It's definitely going to be a transformational event in terms of how Europeans perceive global security, not just regional one. I don't have the numbers to support it, but I would say that there will be a massive change in threat perception, and not necessarily related only to how Europeans see Russia. Ukrainian case also showed that for all its glory, international recognition and various international guarantees didn't, stop Ukraine, didn't stop Russia from attacking Ukraine. So it's actually the relations that the partnership that Ukraine managed to build that helps Ukraine now, but it didn't really stop Russia from moving on. And Russia was very likely quite confident, and now we know that it was overconfident, that what happened in 2014 can in larger scale happen in 2022, and not much will happen, and they were wrong. And then we have developments like NATO discussing openly what would cross-strait conflict mean for the alliance. That was like 2 weeks ago. And if already NATO sort of going out with that, they announced that we discussed that, then you can be sure that what preceded was very detailed and very intensive discussion across many months. And there's a lot to say, but I think we can leave that for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this overview. And I had to smile when you said that suddenly Europe was concerned about what Taiwan meant for its own security. And I think in that way, the very first EU's Indo-Pacific strategy that was released a bit more than a year ago said for the very first time that tensions in the Taiwan Strait may have a direct impact on European security and prosperity. And that was really, I think, a first, but correct me if I'm wrong. Without further ado, I would like to turn to my colleague, actually, at the Europe Center, visiting fellow Peter Tuma. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary, for the floor. I'll try to complement what was already said on Central and Eastern Europe engagement towards Taiwan. The fact that Michal is here probably strengthened the importance and the role our region plays in helping Taiwan. I'll try to present a short 5-minute, 7-minute crash course overview of who does why what in our region towards Taiwan. And has been already mentioned, well, I mean, the importance is that to see that Central Eastern Europe is not monolith, is not homogeneous, that we have there leaders as Lithuania or Czech Republic in regards to Taiwan, and we have also Hungary. So we have to look at this carefully. And then also I'd like to underline the fact that one thinking about the cooperation with Taiwan, you have to distinguish the relations with Taiwan and what you do towards China. Thus you have countries who are, quite hawkish on China, such as Estonia or Latvia in Baltics, who are not necessarily leading in Taiwan. But on the other hand, you have countries like Poland, who are quite friendly and open to cooperation with China. I would say partly due to the president, whose term would be soon over, and he might be looking for Chinese support for his next job. But at the same time, Poland, as much as it is open to China, it's stepping up on Taiwan as well. But to say, well, Czech Republic and Lithuania have been already mentioned as two leading countries in support of Taiwan. I'd say few reasons. We already heard about ideological common ground, so I would skip this. We in Central Europe, we somehow, say we try to support weaker, smaller countries against the oppressor. Taiwan's democratization process pretty much coincides with similar process in Central Europe, and in case of Czech Republic, it all started with Václav Havel in early 90s. He thought that this is the case we have to support, and Škoda went there in 1993, our big car producer, and is there still quite active and growing. It's also for Czech Republic, Lithuania, and other countries in Central Eastern Europe supporting Taiwan. It's about security, international order, supply chains, as we already heard. One other reason I would like to mention is U.S. connection. Like in cases of Lithuania, in the beginning, definitely it was a way how to score some points in Washington, but also hoping, and it's for us and for the others, that helping here the US and Taiwan, we can get support on Eastern Front, and actually it worked. It's also about business opportunities. Several countries from our region understand that there might be economic opportunities. In case of Czech Republic, it's obvious. The Taiwan investments were higher in recent years than Chinese ones. They generated way more jobs than China, and it might be a showcase. I know that it doesn't work in the same way for all countries, but we can lead, and Taiwan has to understand the importance of these. Somehow, I would say still under-investing in Europe and more focused on China. So this needs a particular attention here. And as Michal mentioned, Ukraine, Russia, does Chinese support for the invasion have somehow soured China's image in Eastern Europe and might generate a farther push? Finally, let me think about briefly mention what Central Europe does and should do in support of Taiwan. It's mainly about political support in several forms, helping Taiwan to step up within international organizations, especially and those who are technical. UN seems to be no-go for a moment, but there are other organizations where we can really succeed. I think it's also important for us to bring it up in Europe. Michal mentioned that it's still not very much the big issue, and I agree. Czechs did it. I think this was also an example how this can work during our recent presidency. Wherever we could, we just mentioned it. We just mentioned Taiwan and the importance of security in Taiwan Strait. It's about it's important to building the contacts either on high level, as was the case of Czech Parliament Speaker Vystrčil, or Mayor of Prague Hřib, who has been in Taiwan, Taipei, or our current Foreign Minister Lipavsky, who is also bringing up Taiwan wherever he can. But contact building is also important on lower level, people to people contacts. People in Taiwan should know more about EU and understand why they should take care of us, be interested in, and for us in Europe also. I think more needs to be done from Taiwan. Taiwan should become an election issue people are still somehow confused whether it's Taiwan or Thailand. So once you would like to get more attention, more support of Taiwan, people should know more also about it. And let me finish this with a call for the need of deeper institutionalization. I think that we have now a momentum that we can get some support for Taiwan, but in other countries, it's also due to the favorable election results in Czech Republic or in Lithuania. In Lithuania, there is not consensus all over the political spectrum that the current policies on China, on Taiwan should be as they are now in place. And in case of Czech Republic, it's about the same. So we might have elections in 3 years' time. Who knows who will get into the parliament, who will lead the coalition, and thus it's really crucial now to build on these, use this momentum, institutionalize this ties, and in creating a favorable atmosphere for cooperation, for business. Let me finish here.
Thank you very much, Peter, and for this also pointing out of the diversity of the Central and Eastern European countries that sometimes is overlooked. So, but I see that I've got already a raised hand to probably react, and then we will go through the questions. For the audience, don't hesitate to use that question and answer as well while we listen to you, Tim. Your micro is you muted.
Sorry, still happens 2 years in, and I forgot to. I have a bad habit of promising something at the beginning of my presentation and then not totally forgetting about it. But I promised I will say a few words about Germany, and of course Germany will be a crucially important for the direction the EU will actually take, and we can see on the recent case of the sale of a share in the Hamburg port that German decision making can be very complicated and somehow really difficult to understand in some ways, because in the situation where every single relevant government agency, and that's already something when in Germany the foreign ministry actually agrees with intelligence services on one thing, because they usually don't, and everyone in one voice opposed the sale of the share in a very important German port, and then the chancellor still went ahead and approved it, notwithstanding all the opposition, and so that's. I would just close it with like expressing hope that I hope, and I'm sure that it's not just me, that in 10 years time we will not see Germany having the same sort of wake up moment as it is having now with Russia. And I think it's 50-50 because somehow the approach to China that the current German government has seems like very oddly similar to how German government was approaching Russia 15-20 years ago.
Yeah, it's definitely something that is also very present here in the debates in DC. What the strategic dependency from Russia, the energy dependency from Russia should not also be replicated for China regarding trade and adapting a new policy. But let me start maybe with the questions, and I would actually like to focus on the economic ties. And this question is going to be a bit for everybody because. Here in the United States, the U.S.-Taiwan initiative on 21st century trade has been really drafted and is being implemented to deepen trade and investment relationship. And there's been thinking over the potential of a trade deal with Taiwan. And I was wondering, maybe turning first to Frank Kramer, what are your thoughts on this and how you expect it to be taking place? And also for the rest of the audience, that I saw some statements of the Taiwanese Taiwanese trade minister calling for a trade deal also with the EU. And I was wondering what is the debate right now in Europe regarding this prospect, and also in the UK, what are the intents regarding potential trade deals? So please, maybe first turning to Frank. And
thanks, Marie. So I think the baseline should be said that the United States and Taiwan have very substantial trade already. I'm in favor of the improving it, but I think that the actual amounts of trade probably will not significantly go up. And I think the real issue is what should we try and focus on? So obviously, information technology, supply chains is one. Direct investment, which the U.S. is encouraging, of course, with respect to TSMC in Arizona, which has already been mentioned. I also think that there are some other areas that we could really work together very closely on, and one of them has to deal with climate and green energy issues. Taiwan has a green hydrogen roadmap. The United States is pushing forward on hydrogen. And so I think this is an area where there could be significant collaboration. So, and not only that, but I think, again, this is something that the US, Taiwan, European countries, or alternatively in the context of the Union, could go out to the global South. So I'm be delighted to have more trade between the U.S. and Taiwan, but I don't think the overall numbers are the key issue. I think the key issues relate to key focus areas, and to think whether or not we can enhance trade. And I won't go into a long story, but I mentioned digital also as another area where I think a lot can be done.
Thank you. Does anybody else in the panel has a view on what's happening on the European side? What are the views on increasing trade deals? Connection? All right. It froze for a moment, sorry. So let's move on with a question of our audience, which is, does anyone in the panel sees a way forward to align European security outlook towards the issue of Taiwan, especially considering the current increasingly assertive US policy toward kinetic over-deterrence against China regarding its intention to invade Taiwan? What would be a most profitable way forward to promote more understandings and alignment so that Taiwan will no longer simply be a US problem? And I will just also add my personal note that earlier this month we had the US-EU dialogue on the Indo-Pacific and one on China, and it was in the joint statement they actually shared the concern of on what's happening in the tensions on Taiwanese Strait. So I think this kind of format actually really helped to raise awareness, at least at the EU level, if not the member states. But maybe let me turn to our panelists to answer that question. Yeah, in Prague, maybe.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the EU should do or European states, but I can tell what would be the absolutely worst what the Europe could do, and it would be to sort of play a third party in this conflict or in this dispute. So I think the most favorable outcome for everyone involved is that we have a direct and honest discussion with not only with the US but also with other countries like Australia and Japan, and not having these discussions in isolation over here, but talk with the partners globally and have develop a better common understanding what's our vulnerabilities, what we could do under certain conditions, what would happen, and what our role would be if the worst case scenario comes to happen, but definitely not sort of play a third neutral party. we can't be that, and then we shouldn't try be that.
If I may, Mary. Yeah, I think that nobody expects that EU, European countries will become a major military power in the area of Indo-Pacific, but still we have other means how to help our joint effort to deter China from the invasion and to somehow maintain the stability. In the business, in security, like cyber security, we can be quite active in there, and we are already stepping up. And just in general, create a scene, an atmosphere in which it won't be feasible or it won't pay off for Xi to attack Taiwan. I still believe that it is feasible, that it is doable.
To utilize gas as a transition capability, it's purchasing, if I recall correctly, 16 LNG tankers, though they won't all be here tomorrow. And so that, I think, is something we can do together. I already mentioned the green hydrogen approach, which would, if it's effective, works out, would help both with respect to climate, but also with respect to resilience, because it could be done on the island. In the context of a blockade, for example, that's a very difficult problem because the likelihood is that insurers would not insure ships going through in the context of a wartime situation. The 16 LNG tankers would be very helpful, but we would then face the situation where, in substance, the United States and then whoever, any other country they wanted to, would have to consider how to deal with the blockade. And of course, that gets into the issue of direct confrontation with China. And while there's certainly contingency planning going on, there's no precise decision as to what the U.S. would do. The president has said we would defend Taiwan, but the specifics are yet to be determined. I'll stop there.
All right, we are at the end of our time here, so I just would like to give big thanks to our panelists and to our audience questions, and it was my very big privilege for me. And let me turn back to Colleen Cottle for final remarks and closing of this session.
Thanks, Marie, and a huge kudos to both our moderators for both of the panels, as well as all of the panelists in each of the panels who covered a tremendous amount of ground, temporally, regionally, and lots of domains, particularly in this last panel spanning political, econ, security, technology. I could keep listing them. I personally learned a lot in this session, and I know our audience did as well. We appreciate the audience questions that came in and all the interactions we had there. And thanks to you all for taking the time to tune in. We're looking forward to the release of this report early next week. Thanks again to our outstanding author Jessica for that report, and wishing you all a happy and healthy end to 2022. And we look forward to convening more events in the new year. So thank you, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.